Welcome to class, everyone. Let's dive right in. Today, we're doing an explainer on something you've probably all participated in, but maybe haven't analyzed critically yet: the anthropology of global tourism. We're going to put the world's absolute largest industry under the microscope. We aren't just looking at it as a massive economic engine, but as this incredibly complex web of human interactions, cultural exchanges, and, well, power dynamics. Before we get too deep into the theory, I want you to ask yourself a quick question. When you travel, when you go on a study abroad trip or a summer vacation, are you just a tourist looking for a relaxing getaway? Or are you actually an active participant in global power dynamics? It's kind of a heavy thought, right? But as you'll see today, packing your suitcase involves a whole lot more than just checking the weather and picking the right clothes. Here's the roadmap for today's lecture. First, we'll look at power, dependency, and inequality. Second, commodifying our cultural heritage. Third, protecting intangible traditions. And finally, we're going to wrap up with the ecotourism alternative. All right, let's jump right into section 1, power, dependency, and inequality. We've got to talk about global inequalities. To really understand the anthropology of travel, we literally have to zoom way out to the macro political economy. Look at that number. $3.5 trillion. That's the estimated total value of global tourism activity. We are talking about massive world-shifting economic weight here. For a lot of developing nations, this is actually their main source of foreign exchange. But listen, if we only look at the dollar signs, we're making a huge mistake. We'd be completely overlooking the real, ground-level social, cultural, and environmental impacts playing out every single day. So, to grasp those hidden impacts, anthropologists rely heavily on dependency theory. Essentially, this is the argument that developing countries have these deeply ingrained external and internal structures that keep them in a dependent position relative to developed countries. What does that mean? Well, basically, bringing peripheral economies into the global capitalist system ends up siphoning their economic surplus right back to the dominant nations. The wealthy countries keep getting richer at the expense of the less fortunate ones, which honestly mirrors old historical patterns of colonialism. When we apply this theory directly to the tourism industry, we see a really stark contrast. You've got the core, these are the wealthy tourist-generating nations, versus the periphery, the developing tourist destinations. The anthropologist Stephen Britton famously called this the enclave model. He pointed out that metropolitan firms often completely dictate the tourist experience. They own the airlines, the hotels, the tour companies, the whole shebang. They organize the development in the periphery in a way that just reinforces that structural dependency. So the destination provides the infrastructure and the labor, while the transnational companies keep the lion's share of the profits. Moving right along to section 2, commodifying our cultural heritage. Let's talk about culture for consumption. So how does this massive economic imbalance physically shape the actual places we visit? In our field, we often use Sherry Ortner's concept of the key symbol. This is something that represents an entire culture, society, or country, totally transcending its localized values to become this globally recognized icon. Think of the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Statue of Liberty. But the critical question is, what actually happens when a local lived-in space gets packaged up for global consumption? Let's take the Taj Mahal, for example. Anthropologically speaking, it's what we call a polysemic structure. That just means it has completely different meanings depending on who's looking at it. For the indigenous population, it's a tomb, and because of its active mosque, it's a place of profound religious significance. But for global tourists, it gets packaged and consumed as this universal symbol of romantic love and national heritage. To cater to that global gaze, the religious and specific cultural roots are often downplayed just so it can be sold as an easily digestible, universal product. And we see this deeply painful contradiction pop up when we try to preserve ancient spaces while simultaneously exploiting them for revenue. Look at the Bhimbetka rock shelters in India. These caves feature absolutely incredibly fragile prehistoric art, but the booming cultural tourism threatens the cave walls themselves. Tourists interacting with the art causes irreparable wear and tear. So as anthropologists, we're faced with a classic dilemma here. How do we possibly balance the scientific conservation of our ancient human heritage with the intense economic demand to open it up for tourist dollars? This leads us into a broader categorization of heritage itself. We usually divide it into tangible heritage, like the buildings, monuments, artifacts, and natural landscapes we were just talking about, and intangible heritage, which covers living, breathing practices. We're talking festivals, dances, culinary traditions, and rituals. Which brings us to section 3, protecting intangible traditions. let's look at how we safeguard these practices. Seriously, how do human traditions survive the intense modifying pressures of the tourist gaze? Let's track the evolution of the Kalbelia tribe in Rajasthan. Historically, they were traditional snake charmers, but as times changed, that traditional livelihood was severely threatened. Then, around 2010, their dance, which beautifully mimics the movements of a serpent, was listed as UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. Fast forward to today, and they perform staged versions of these dances for their livelihoods. So tourism definitely commercialized their art, transforming it from a deeply integrated way of life into a staged performance, but it also arguably saved it from total extinction. Now, this cultural struggle extends right down into daily life, literally onto our dinner plates. Edible identities are fiercely protected in tangible heritage. Take the Kolkata biryani, famous for the historical addition of potatoes by Nawab Wajid Ali Shah. Or consider the rasgulla. You might not know this, but there was a bitter 2-year-long geographical indication legal battle between West Bengal and Odisha over who legitimately owned the historical origins of this sweet. Food isn't just calories. It demarcates social boundaries and historical narratives. To sum that idea up, heritage is not an entity limited to only brick and mortar. It refers to places, objects, and ideas that are culturally and socially valued. Living festivals like Holi or the Chow martial dance aren't just colorful tourist attractions. They are absolutely vital mechanisms for maintaining social solidarity and a collective sense of belonging, even when millions of global travelers are showing up just to watch. But we have to be highly critical of something called the authorized heritage discourse. This happens when external authorities prioritize what the tourists expect to see over the authentic, complex local realities, ultimately silencing indigenous history. A prime example is the Tibetan community in the Meili Snow Mountains. These mountains are profoundly sacred to the indigenous Tibetans, yet they were listed by UNESCO strictly as a natural heritage site. That designation totally ignored the area's deep cultural significance to the locals. It basically rebranded their sacred home into a scenic natural park for outsiders, effectively erasing their indigenous history from the map. Okay, moving to our final section, Section 4, the ecotourism alternative. Let's explore a sustainable path forward. So, what's the solution? How on earth do we break the cycle of dependency and cultural commodification? Well, the answer might lie in true ecotourism. Formally, we define this as environmentally responsible travel to natural areas that promotes conservation and provides for the beneficially active socioeconomic involvement of local populations. Notice the emphasis there. If the local people aren't economically benefiting and actively managing the project themselves, folks, it just isn't ecotourism. For ecotourism to actually succeed in the real world, it requires 3 distinct levels of empowerment. First is political empowerment. The community needs real local decision-making power and representation. Second is social empowerment. The profits from tourism absolutely must fund local projects, think water systems or health clinics, to strengthen community cohesion. And third, maybe the trickiest one, is psychological empowerment. The project has to build self-reliance and pride in local traditions, rather than forcing locals to alter their culture just to put on a show for outsiders. And we actually see this theory put into incredibly successful practice in Nagaland. In Konoma Village, the local village council completely banned logging and hunting, creating a highly successful community-led conservation project. Similarly, to protect the Amur falcon, local councils stepped up and made hunting illegal. That single move turned a migratory bird roost into a thriving ecotourism site, and it is entirely managed by the people who actually live there. It's a real game changer. So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that ecotourism works when local tribes transition from being displaced residents to active, enterprise-owning stakeholders. Take the Parambakulam Tiger Reserve down in Kerala. Instead of tribal communities being violently evicted by the government to make a protected park, they actually own the ecotourism enterprises. They guide the treks, they create the bamboo handicrafts, and they process the local honey. They aren't just working there, they own the economic engine itself. We see this incredibly delicate balancing act attempted elsewhere, too. On Majuli Island in Assam, the local ethnic communities are using ecotourism to actively protect their ancient pottery, their mask-making, and their monasteries from both cultural loss and heavy river erosion. Or look at the Great Run of Kutch and the Gir Forest in Gujarat. Authorities and communities there are constantly working side by side to balance stringent wildlife conservation with the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of indigenous community development. To bring our whole anthropological analysis together for today, Community-based approaches completely shift the dynamic, from regulation and top-down patronage right over to empowerment and true partnership. Sustainable development in the world's largest industry absolutely requires that marginalized communities own and manage their own heritage. They cannot just be used as a scenic backdrop for tourists from the global core. Which brings us to our final thought for today's class. Now that you understand the political economy, the complex cultural commodification, and the ecological impacts of travel, what choices are you going to make the next time you pack your suitcase? Really think about it. All right, that's it for today's explainer. Thank you for joining me. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the world critically. I'll see you next time.